Most of the mechanical parts have been cleaned in the ultrasonic cleaner, which is a fairly simple process because all I do is put the parts, those pieces I've identified as being suitable to go through the cleaner, into an old baked bean tin, I think it is, and make sure it's well covered in a solvent, and the solvent I use is a degreaser, a painter's degreaser, used for degreasing paintwork prior to painting, and I find that best at dissolving the old grease, softening it up so that it can be easily washed away. And so I give it 10 minutes in the ultrasonic cleaner in that. The tin sits in the ultrasonic cleaner surrounded by water. The tin has the solvent in it, the painter's degreaser, and the parts, I suspect, just sitting loose in the tin. So it gets 10 minutes in the ultrasonic cleaner in that solvent. Then I pour off all the solvent out of the tin, fill up my ultrasonic cleaner with hot water and some ammonia-based detergent, put the pieces into the ultrasonic cleaner, and it gets 10 minutes in the detergent. After that, I just pour all my parts into a sieve, run it under the hot tap, and dry all the components with a hairdryer. And that works very well for me. I end up with parts which are sparkly and clean, and probably shinier than they've ever been before in their lives. But some parts need to be cleaned manually. Anything with paint on, you don't want to put through the ultrasonic cleaner, it'll strip the paint off. So anything with markings, you don't put through the cleaner. The body here is simply being cleaned with naphtha, cigarette lighter fluid. I'm just wanting to remove traces of old grease, because the old grease will have gathered up dust, and that process turns it from grease into a grinding paste. And it'll also have gone sticky, so that instead of things moving smoothly, they'll be reluctant to move at all. Now this surface here has got the remains of leatherette, the backing of the leatherette on it, so I want to clean that off. It'll come off with some acetone most likely. It'll probably come off with scraping. And I've got some CRC Lectra clean which will also soften that stuff up. So I'm just using the back of my scalpel blade here to scrape that surface, taking off the big lumps and bumps. I'm going to use some of this CRC Lectra clean. Being careful not to run this down the leatherette on the camera body. Just run some of that on there. And that tends to soften up that stuff. The adhesive and the leftover fragments of leatherette. And as you can see, that cleans off pretty well. That staining will probably remain. That's of no consequence at all. All we need to do is make sure we get all the loose stuff off, all the lumps and bumps, anything that would stop the leatherettes from sitting down flush and smooth on the camera body. So that's pretty much it. That camera body is as clean as it needs to be, and now can be put to one side and all the components put back in it one by one. We'll just check inside the back of the camera. What can we see in here? Well, there's the usual bit of grease and dust here at the base of the film, because the take-up spool, where the take-up spool sits. So I'll just use a bit of naphtha and clean that. And where the shaft comes through, for the sprocket shaft, usually there's a bit of grease or something there. Looking at the rest of it, that looks pretty clean. That needs to be brushed out with a paintbrush, I think, just to shift anything else. Just dust really in here now. That's that. That's the body. This piece, the shroud, this will be quite greasy because there's a fair bit of grease inside that from where the inner section slides in it. And I want all that grease off because it will have gathered up any grit and sand and dust over time, and that will not be helping the action at all. So you'll go through a fair few of these in the process of cleaning. That's quite normal, and they're as cheap as chips anyway. Years ago when I worked for Kodak, they were dished out in a very sparing manner. It's almost like you had to send in a written request every time you wanted a few. You certainly didn't get them in boxes to run through and use up as you liked. Now, of course, in those days the cameras were far from new, but they were a lot newer than they are today. So they'd had decades less time to gather up filth and dust and dried grease. You can see there's a little threaded bush in here, here and here. Well, there's one that fell out of here when I was taking the camera apart. Now they're only pressed in. The hole is not circular, it's sort of D-shaped. Because there's almost no meat left here, it means that the shroud there doesn't hold that bush in as firmly as it does in the other positions where the insert is further from an edge. So don't be surprised if they rattle loose, and it's certainly not the end of the world, it's just a minor nuisance. Right, well, I'm pleased with the state of that shroud. Here's the front standard. You can see the oil on there, I think. Those brown spots, that's the oil. It's come through. It's the grease from the helical in the main, the focus helical. And it's just sweated out of the helical threads and just run into here. It runs past here, it gets into the back of the shutter, and that's the source, generally the source of the oil that you're going to get on your shutter blades with these shutters, unless someone was particularly enthusiastic with the grease inside the shutter. So this part I'm just cleaning with naphtha. You can see here where possibly graphite grease has been used there. All that filthy grey colour may simply be the result of the aluminium wearing as a result of the pins from the front door working on that spot all the time. I certainly wouldn't use graphite grease in that position. It's bound to look messy. This is where the finger for the shutter release goes, and that surface needs to be all nice and clean. The felt gasket, if you like, in there, that may or may not come off easily. Sometimes it sticks to the bellows. It's okay. Typically you want it on here, not on the bellows. Sometimes it comes off in 2 pieces or 3 pieces even. That's fine. I just glue it back in here before I put everything back together. It's hardly a critical component. It needs to be complete if it's there so that you're not providing any light leak path. But later cameras, the 3 big C cameras, a lot of those did not have that felt washer at all, that spacer or gasket or light trap. A lot of them, those cameras never had it, and obviously it didn't hold them back at all. Right, so much for that. Here's our focus scale ring. Just making sure I get all the old grease and stuff off that. Often the little focus tab there will show a lot of build-up of grease and finger dirt and so forth. So you clean that out. You may even need to use a toothpick if the stuff's really caked on, but it just makes it sparkle a lot better. Focus scale ring on this camera, although it's feet. So this one was made for the British market or the American market. If it was sold in the American market, it probably would have had the numbers on an EK prefix on the serial number, which I haven't checked on. I suppose I should have a look. Yes, it does indeed have EK prefix on the serial number there, which stands for Eastman Kodak, and that shows that the camera was originally imported into the States for sale by Eastman Kodak. Okay, so much for that. I think I'm just about ready to start reassembling the body. I usually start with this piece. On the earliest 3Cs, there'll actually be a metal shim in here. That was fairly quickly dispensed with. Oh, that bracket there, I was going to check the angle of that because I decided that was not bent at 90 degrees. So I better go and get a pair of pliers and put on my best right angle judging eyeballs and see if I can get that right. Here you might be able to see that there's a gap there. This finger is certainly not at 90 degrees. So I need to give that a little tweak. I've got a pair of smooth jawed pliers here. That's almost it. Yeah, that's a lot better. Okay, that's good. So how did it get like that? Well, it couldn't have got like that by accident. Somebody would have had to have done something to that. Now there's 2 of these shoulder screws here. The larger of the 2 goes in the top position. The smaller of the 2 goes down here. Yeah, it's typically what's happened when you find that finger here bent downwards is that someone has leant in from the front of the camera and twisted it downwards with the tip of a screwdriver or a pair of pliers or something of that nature in order to change the relationship of the timing of the release of the shutter relative to the film advance. And that's not the correct way to do it. But that's the way some people do it. I think you could safely say that it's the sort of thing that's done when someone's doing a final check of the camera after having completed a repair and then decide at that point that the timing's not correct, and rather than take the top cover off and make the adjustment correctly, they choose to lean in and make a little tweak and fix it that way. I'm going to apply a little bit of graphite powder here and here, work it in and then blow it away. The reason I'm using graphite powder in this position and not something else is that graphite powder never goes sticky, which means it doesn't attract dust and grit, and as a result it doesn't cause you problems further down the road. I'll just go and blow away all that excess powder. Alright, to assemble these pieces together, first I want to apply some synthetic grease to the inside of the shroud, where the lens standard runs on these guide rails, top and bottom. So I'm just making sure that they get some grease. This is synthetic grease. It doesn't tend to change much over time. So I just want to get some on those rails. Now I've got to put the buttons in here. So I'm taking a little of the same grease, just running it around the inside there and through the hole. Take our buttons and their springs. Now that spring's looking a little bit compressed, so I'm just going to give that a stretch slightly. Just means it's lost a bit of tension. Its mate probably the same. You don't need to pull them out for miles, you just need to make them a little bit longer than they currently are. They go in the holes, they do not go over the pin. In taking a button, fit that in place on one side. I'm holding that with my finger so it doesn't fall out. Do the same on the other side and holding them squeezed between finger and thumb. Pick up the shroud and slide that through. Check the action, make sure it's smooth. Now we have this piece. This piece is called the sleeve. The sleeve always wants to get away. So I'm holding this down with my finger and I can slide that into position. And then if I collapse the front so that this can't fall out, that's a nice safe unit ready to go back in the camera. Of course, it lacks that little piece there, that's the bush that fell out. That goes on the inside here. It holds a D shape. Let's press that into place. It's pressed firmly into place, but that doesn't mean it won't fall out when I'm working on the camera. So put that carefully to one side and prepare the body. Now, what do we need to do here? We need to put back in the transfer shaft and the little bracket that holds the transfer shaft in place. So, taking a little bit of grease, same synthetic grease I was using earlier. Inox is the brand of this stuff. There's probably 1,000 other products that would also work, which I haven't tested. And why would I? Because I've got one that works. So we'll put that shaft in place. Here is the bracket that holds that in position. Slide that down into place. Support it with my finger from underneath. And I've got to get this little screw, which is a short round-headed screw, into position. I've just done that up lightly. Now, one of the things that's critical here is the spacing between the bracket, which you might see in that slot, and the casting. If that gap's too narrow, then the cocking rack will not be able to move smoothly. If that gap's too wide, the cocking rack will be able to slop backwards and forwards to such an extent that the little gear on the shaft and the cocking rack are not in full contact across the width of the rack, which means that the teeth of the rack will likely get chewed off if they're only half of the width of that is engaged. So it's important to have that nice and snug, but by the same token you need enough clearance there that things will move smoothly. Here I've got a feeler gauge 4/1000th of an inch, which is 0.1 millimeters, and that's the clearance I've found that works well. So I'm loosening that screw off, push it back towards the back of the camera as hard as it'll go, tighten the screw up, take out my feeler gauge and check that the rack moves smoothly. Now that action's not particularly smooth to me, so I'm looking in here and I can see that that bracket has kicked over as I tighten the screw most likely, so I'm just pushing it back into square. And that was probably too much. That looks better. I'll check the action of that rack. It's still too tight for my liking. I'm going to slacken that screw off and have another go. Yeah, that feeler gauge doesn't want to go down there, so obviously you've done that up too tight. And on the second attempt, things are moving nice and smoothly. So I'm pleased with the state of that. We can put our rack to one side. We don't need to deal with that at the moment. We've got to get this back in the body. Okay, so this just needs to slide in. That shaft should come up through the centre, and you notice I've got the lens board collapsed back fairly well. There are 4 screws that hold this in position. 2 of them will be corroded, or they'll have glue or something on them from coming from the base of the camera, and 2 of them are probably nice and clean. Now, we already know as soon as I start doing up this screw, most likely I'll displace that bush. So I'll put that in last of all, I think. The others are probably in a bit firmer, and I can probably get my screws started without displacing them. I'm not doing these screws up tight at this stage. And almost no down pressure on that screwdriver because I don't want to displace that screw. Right, this one here, I'm going to extend my bellows out all the way, but before I do that, I want to make sure that that sleeve can't get away. So I'm going to install the shutter release shaft through there, and that'll just stop that sleeve from being able to escape. Now with this fully extended, I can slide my finger in underneath and support that bush so it doesn't push out of the way, and get that screw started. Okay, so that's done up tight. Now I can do these 4 screws up tight. I'll collapse the front of the camera again. Get that shaft through there, that's it. I'm holding that shutter release in there with my fingers but in practice that sleeve probably can't get away because the front's collapsed. Do up these other two screws on the base of the camera, and that should be good. Okay, so that part is done, and I will put this to one side. At this stage it'd be very handy to have the rewind back in position so that I can string a rubber band between it and the shutter release and not lose the shutter release. So the inner part of our rewind here, I'm just looking at that, making sure there's no screw stuck down in the hole, which often there is once I've been busy putting strings through the cleaner. This has got a little tab on it, so it only goes in one way and should slide all the way through like that. Here is the bush. Now this style of bush has a little insert in it, brass of some sort, and I'm just making sure that I get grease in there. Get my shaft started in there and check that that moves smoothly in the centre there. It'll be stiffer when it's fully up, that's quite normal. Okay, so there is our rewind, and the rewind just goes on the body here with two screws. So as always, get all of the screws installed first, and once all of the screws holding something are in place, then you can tighten them. If you just tighten the first screw up, you probably find it's difficult getting the second screw tightened up. Now I need a rubber band from here to here. That's to stop this falling out, which in turn will stop the sleeve from falling out, or indeed the return spring that I haven't fitted yet. Right, so I'll just collapse that front. Take out my shutter release shaft. Now this piece I want to lubricate that with a bit of I want to lubricate this with a little wipe of molybdenum paste. So I'm just giving that a wipe, and this doesn't need to be any more than leaving dirty marks really. That's just so this will move smoothly. So I feed that in from the top, it passes through the sleeve, and I've got a return spring for that. Now not all cameras that you strike will have this spring, and that's because some production the spring wasn't used, and with some production the spring was used but the camera has been serviced at a later date and the spring has become lost, and sometimes it's fallen out when someone has removed the shutter release and allowed it to fall out. I'm just putting a rubber band across here, and it's just to stop this from falling out so that the spring doesn't get away and the sleeve doesn't get away. Okay, so that's our sliding section back in and working nicely. And the next thing to put into here is our focus mount.